A few months ago, I spent a week in Bordeaux, and I devoted an entire day of that trip to visiting producers in Saint-Emilion. I thought it would be a good idea to visit both of the Premier Grand Cru Classé producers. One of these estates is a property that the Romans were already farming and producing wine on 2,000 years ago. The other is an estate that was rescued by a former professional cyclist who used to sell fruit out of a truck. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into both and share what I learned during this visit. But first, I'll provide a little bit more information about Saint-Emilion and how the Saint-Emilion classification system works. Unlike the 1855 classification of Bordeaux, the Saint-Emilion classification is quite dynamic. It came out in 1955, and it's already been updated 7 times. More recently, it's been reevaluated every 10 years or so. The 2 most recent revisions took place in 2012 and 2022, and estates must apply and comply with a number of burdensome application requirements in order to be considered. Among other things, this includes blind tasting analyses, evaluations of the terroir, and a comprehensive review of the production methods, among other things. There's 3 tiers in the Saint-Emilion classification, beginning with Grand Cru Classé at the bottom, and continuing to Premier Grand Cru Classé B, and at the top there's Premier Grand Cru Classé A. Confusingly, there's also many Saint-Emilion wines that say Grand Cru on the label, but this is a larger, much looser categorization, and it has nothing to do with the Saint-Emilion classification. For most of the history of the Saint-Emilion classification, there were 2 estates that dominated the top of the rankings, Chateau Cheval Blanc and Chateau Ozone. In 2012, both Chateau Angelus and Chateau Pavie were elevated to Premier Grand Cru Classé A, joining Ozone and Chateau Cheval Blanc at the very top of the classification. But ahead of the 2022 revisions to the Saint-Emilion classification, both Chateau Cheval Blanc and Chateau Ozone announced that they would not be applying. Chateau Angelus quickly followed suit. To be sure, this terrific trio of producers continued to make world-class wines, and their reputations didn't really take much of a hit at all. They just decided that for them individually, the time and expense of complying with the classification process was not worth it for them, particularly given their long-standing history of producing world-class wines. But of course, for many Saint-Emilion producers that don't have the reputation and history of Cheval Blanc and Ozone, the classification remains extremely important. Following these departures, when the 2022 Saint-Emilion classification came out, there were again 2 producers at the very top, Chateau Figeac and Chateau Pavie. Figeac is arguably one of the oldest continuously occupied wine estates in all of Saint-Emilion. It traces its history way back to the 2nd century, when a Roman landowner named Figeacus owned the estate and gave the property its name. Figeac has been owned by the same family since 1892, and certainly in the past 15 years or so, they've had a dramatic increase in quality. This all started with the 2012 updates to the Saint-Emilion classification. At that time, Figeac was hoping to become elevated to Premier Grand Cru Classé A. Unfortunately, that application was denied, and in that denial, they learned that they still had a lot of work to do to be recognized as one of the premier estates in Saint-Emilion. But Figeac immediately got to work. They named Frédéric Fay, who'd been with the estate for a number of years, as the technical director, and they also hired Michel Roland as consulting winemaker. They also began an ambitious renovation to their wine cellars and winemaking facilities. Among other things, this allowed them to install gravity flow winemaking equipment and to start doing plot-by-plot vinification, which gave them much more precision in their winemaking. While Chateau Figeac is located in Saint-Emilion, it's right near the Pomerol border. It's located in an extremely prestigious area near Cheval Blanc and not far from Concillon. During my visit, I learned that Figeac wines are a little bit distinguishable from many of the right bank wines in that they have a substantial percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon. In fact, their wines are typically almost equal percentages of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot, which is definitely quite unusual for Bordeaux's right bank. This is due to the fact that they have a substantial amount of gravelly soils in their vineyards that are well suited to the production of Cabernet Sauvignon. The result is an extremely complex wine, but also one that has extraordinary elegance and finesse. I was extremely impressed with their lineup when I visited, and I've been buying back vintages for my personal collection, particularly for vintages like 2009, 2015 and 16, and 2018. One of the great things I enjoy about Figeac is how when you enjoy the wine at different stages, different components of the blend will come to the forefront. For example, when these wines are young, the Merlot tends to dominate and be a little bit more expressive. With a little bit more time, Cabernet Franc will come to the center. But with some extended aging, the Cabernet Sauvignon is the star. Figeac is very much at the top of its game. In my view, it's an extremely unique and exciting wine, in large part because of the rocky soils and also the higher Cabernet percentages that you'll find in these wines. In addition to the vintages I've mentioned before, some other vintages worth pursuing include 2019, 2020, 2022, and 2023. 2025 Figeac continues an incredible run of strong vintages for this outstanding producer. In fact, this wine is a candidate for Wine of the Vintage. It certainly compares extremely favorably with the quality of top right bank producers such as Cheval Blanc, Ozone, and Angelus, despite the fact that it sells for a fraction of the price of those other wines. The 2025 vintage has slightly more Merlot than usual at around 38%. This is wine that's extraordinarily elegant, with impressive purity of fruit and layers of flavor. In addition to its top wine, Chateau Figeac has made a second wine for many decades. Since 2012, that wine has been called Petit Figeac. This is a wine that's enjoyable at an earlier time than the top wine, as they include a much higher Merlot percentage in the blend. When I was visiting, I tried the 2021 vintage and found it to be quite enjoyable. It also sells for a fraction of the cost of the top wine. Oftentimes I see it selling for between $50 and $70 per bottle in the United States, depending on the vintage. My new book, Napa Valley Decoded, is already a #1 bestseller and the top new release in wine. This is the book that I wish I had when I first got into Napa Valley many years ago. This book has quickly become a trusted resource for collectors, enthusiasts, and wine professionals. Whether you drink Napa Valley wines, are studying for a certification exam, or are visiting Napa Valley, this book will be an invaluable resource. To learn more, please be sure to check out the link in the description below. In 1998, a former professional cyclist and grocer from Paris named Gérard Perse spent a whopping $31 million to purchase Chateau Pavie. At the time, this estate was dilapidated and the vineyards were badly in need of an overhaul. Perse had previously acquired and turned around Chateau Montbusquet, so he was confident that he could do the same for Chateau Pavie. Perse poured massive amounts of money into overhauling the vineyards and also completely renovated the winery, the wine cellars, and upgraded all the winemaking equipment. By the year 2000, they had a state-of-the-art winery at Chateau Pavie. Unbelievably, despite the fact that this winery was very much state-of-the-art and still an excellent winery that would have lasted for decades, just 10 years later, in 2011, Perse completely destroyed it and started all over again, investing another $15 million into a completely new state-of-the-art winery that was even better. In addition to the costly updates to the winemaking facilities, there was also an update to the chateau that included a fancy marble reception hall, and these updates were designed by famed architect Alberto Pinto. Equally impressive is the art collection that's scattered and used to decorate the marble reception hall as you're entering the property and beginning your tour. To be sure, the quality improvements made by Mr. Perse in the vineyard and in the winemaking facilities improved the objective quality of the wine, and in 2012, Chateau Pavie was elevated to Premier Grand Cru Classé A in the Saint-Emilion Classification. At the same time, however, I should mention that Chateau Pavie has become one of the more controversial and polarizing estates in all of Bordeaux. Following the acquisition, the style of Pavie wines tended to be powerful and concentrated, opaque in color, and there was a high percentage of new oak influence in the wine. As such, traditionalists thought that the wine was too New World in nature and did not faithfully express the Saint-Emilion terroir, whereas other people, such as Robert Parker, were very impressed with the new wines and gave them high marks. Some critics were not big fans of the new style, however. So, for example, you had a dispute that played out in public between Jancis Robinson and Robert Parker regarding the 2003 Pavie. Jancis Robinson did not like that wine very much and gave it a relatively low score, whereas Parker absolutely raved about it and was effusive in his praise. This same controversy has even played out within my tasting group. About 6 months ago, we had a tasting, and towards the end of the night, the topic of Chateau Pavie came up. One person was a huge fan and was even organizing a tasting of Pavie wines for a couple months down the road. With respect to the detractor, I can only say that, like Jancis Robinson, he was not a fan of the style. But unlike Jancis Robinson, his language was definitely not very professional, and it most certainly cannot be repeated on this channel. Given the fact that opinions regarding Pavie's wines can vary so dramatically from person to person, it's certainly a good idea to buy in smaller quantities and perhaps try a bottle or two to make sure that it fits your personal taste preferences before you start buying it in larger quantities. Despite the fact that both Figeac and Pavie are located in Saint-Emilion, their soils could not be much more different. Whereas Figeac had the gravelly soils, Pavie is on the limestone plateau and has very little gravel at all in their soils. Pavie is a big fan of sustainable practices and farms 70% of their plots organically with a goal of getting to 100% in the near future. Pavie has 42 hectares planted to vine, and this breaks down as follows: 45% Merlot, 35% Cabernet Franc, and 20% Cabernet Sauvignon. Many of Pavie's vineyards are located on an elevated location, and they're some of the coolest sites within Saint-Emilion. For that reason, Pavie is always one of the very last producers to complete their harvest in Saint-Emilion. For many recent vintages, the blend for Pavie has been around 50% Merlot, around 1/3 Cabernet Franc, and then Cabernet Sauvignon rounded out the blend. But for the first time ever, beginning with the 2025 vintage, Cabernet Franc is dominant. Pavie matures its wines in 75% new French oak in its very impressive barrel room for 18 to 24 months, depending on the vintage. You can expect flavors and aromas of plum, blackberry, licorice, cedar, graphite, and mixed herbs and spice. Pavie tends to be a powerful wine, and in my view, it definitely benefits from some aging. Notwithstanding the New World comparison from some, this is not a wine that's just fruity and one that you can enjoy in its youth. There's some real structure and power here, and it definitely benefits and becomes more elegant with some extended aging. Another thing I'll add is that beginning with the 2019 vintage, the style seems to have changed somewhat. The wines are a little bit more restrained, and they've dialed back the influence of the new oak somewhat. So if you're someone who's been a critic of the style in the past, you might want to give it another shot, beginning with a more recent vintage. With respect to some of my favorite vintages for Chateau Pavie, I found that I enjoy some of the more recent vintages better. 2010 was certainly quite strong, and then I also enjoyed 2015 and 2016. 2018, 19, and 20 are also quite good. 2022 is exceptional, and 2025 may be one of the best vintages they've ever produced. As mentioned, this one is a little bit of a stylistic outlier in that it's around 60% Cabernet Franc, which was the first time that Cabernet Franc was ever dominant in this blend. If you'd like to learn more about legendary Saint-Emilion-based producer Chateau Cheval Blanc, please be sure to watch this video that's linked above.